Hello, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for being here. I know that there are many competing events happening at the same time and some really important resolution informals. So we really appreciate you being here. We only have an hour for this event, and so we're going to kick off right away. As you can see, we wanted to take this opportunity to give voices to human rights defenders working on LGBTI rights around the world, to be able to provide their perspectives and views and comments on a lot of the issues that they face, and also their views and perspectives on the Human Rights Council processes as well. This event is organized, as you can see, by ARC, CIVICUS, ILGA, and ISHR. As has been highlighted by a number of different special procedures mandate holders, as well as the High Commissioner, recent years have seen an alarming global trend to restrict the work and activism of civil society in all regions of the world. This can include anything from barriers to access funding and registration for organizations, the arbitrary use and application of laws to restrict freedom of expression and assembly, as well as arrests, tortures, and killings of human rights defenders. So within this broader context, human rights defenders who are themselves from or represent marginalized and vulnerable groups are at particular risk, and they require particular attention in order to understand how to design their specific protection needs. So I'm pleased to have here with me such an interesting and dynamic set of panelists who will outline the challenges faced by themselves and their colleagues in the conduct of their work in relation to sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression. I wanted to just add that this event is being filmed. Only the panels will be filmed. If anybody is not comfortable with this, could you please let Andre from ILGA know? So who we have here with us is Joshua Sehoole, who is from Iranti org, based in South Africa. It's a queer visual media organization. We have Natasha Jimenez from Mulabi, the Latin American Space for Sexuality and Rights. It's an NGO that works on sexual and reproductive health and rights of lesbians, bisexual women, trans and intersex people in Costa Rica. She's also the ILGA Intersex Secretariat. And next to me here is Kenita Placide from United and Strong. This is an NGO that works on the rights of LGBTI people in St. Lucia. She's also coordinator at Caraflags, which is a network of NGOs in the Caribbean that work on sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression. And then we have Zhan Chiam, who is the Gender Identity and Gender Expression Officer of ILGA, based here in Geneva. Okay, so I'd just like to ask the panel to start with, in doing your work at the national level, what are the main challenges that human rights defenders that work in the area of sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression face, and what makes these challenges and threats unique and specific to this set of human rights defenders? So maybe I start first with Joshua.
Well, I think one of the first things is the criminalization of our identities. So with a lot of countries having anti-gay legislation, it's difficult to be a member of the LGBTI community and you know, face these challenges on a personal level, but then to come out and advocate for rights for this specific community, because it raises your visibility as an LGBTI person, and therefore increases the chances of persecution on this basis. And I think also specifically in the African context, it's also to do with the social dynamics of our communities. In many cases, our communities are willing to deal with these issues within the community itself. So, for example, I'm Setswana, and I'm from the Bakaka tribe in Marapiani. And when I speak at the Lekgotla, which is a gathering of the elders there, I usually don't experience many problems because there's a strong sense in many of our traditional communities of Ubuntu, and which really focuses on our relationships between each other in the community. So at the Lekgotla right now, I'm a transgender man, and I present at the Lekgotla as male without problem, and this has been in consultation with the elders who said that that's what they would prefer to see. They wouldn't have a problem with me doing that at that level. But unfortunately, the laws and the challenges that often restrict us are external. So have to do with domestic legislation, and kind of the feelings that are dominant the further outside you go of traditional and rural spaces. Which means that when you advocate for LGBTI rights, and you become visible in those spaces, you often have problems from the community back home, because these are seen as things that you kind of have to deal with from within the community. And when you're visible outside of the community, speaking about sex and sexuality and things that are traditionally not like publicly spoken about, you do get increased tension with your community because of that. But unfortunately, the origin of the problems are from outside of the community, and are from often religiously motivated, and often by religions that aren't native to our context and not native to our country. So that creates a need for you to go outside of the community. So it's difficult to maintain kind of community level support. Whereas I think if you're a human rights defender working on land rights, for example, you'd be supported very openly by the community. But, you know, with this area, it makes it a bit more difficult.
En cuanto a ese tema, yo me referiré a 3 puntos principales en cuanto al tema de los obstáculos. Uno es la legislación, el financiamiento y la seguridad de las organizaciones LGBTI en Latinoamérica. Creo que voy a ampliar un poco más, no solo me basaré en Costa Rica.
So, referring to the obstacles, she makes reference to 3 different points. The first one is the right to freedom of association. The second one would be the financial support or the funding. And the third one, the security of the LGBTI associations.
En la región latinoamericana todavía muchos países siguen siendo restrictivos para la población LGBTI, y incluso incluyen leyes que son restrictivas para nuestras poblaciones, ya sea con multas o con cárcel, con alguna penalidad para la población LGBTI o quien promueva los derechos de nuestras poblaciones.
So, in Latin America, there are some restrictive laws, and there are some restrictive, people that are doing some restrictive movements. And in respect to these persons, to the LGBTI community, by, for example, amendments by prison and different ways.
En otros países no hay restricciones a nivel legal, pero sí a la hora de la implementación de las leyes. Entonces es muy difícil para la población LGBTI registrar asociaciones dentro de nuestros países.
So in other countries, there are no legal restrictions to this regard, but when they're trying to register the association, there are some laws they have to face too.
Pongo como ejemplo el caso específico de Mulabi. Tuvimos que hacer el trámite 3 veces porque una persona trans era quien dirige la organización.
So in Mulabi, for example, they tried to register the association 3 times because the leader, was a trans person.
Y eso pasa en muchos países de la región centroamericana y latinoamericana en general.
And the same happens in Latin America in general and Central America.
O sea, como ven, en muchos países no hay leyes específicas que restrinjan la asociación, pero sí a la hora de la implementación sí hay muchos obstáculos.
So there are no specific laws to prohibit this registration of these associations, but when they are trying to implement this, they have some problems.
En el tema del financiamiento para organizaciones LGBTI, sobre todo de organizaciones trans e intersex, hay muy poco financiamiento. Hay un estudio de la organización GATE, que es de Estados Unidos y Argentina, donde refleja que las organizaciones trans tienen muy poco financiamiento. De hecho, va desde 0 a máximo $5,000 para trabajar el tema de derechos humanos. ¿Entendiste todo?
So, referring to the financial support, she said that there are some LGTBI associations, and more often the trans and intersex associations, where they don't have the opportunity to have access to this funding. There is a study, GATE is the name of the study, where a transsexual organization for trans people, they see that they become very little funding. So that is, for example, from $0 to $5,000.
Y para el tema intersex no hay ningún financiamiento en este momento. De hecho, se financia alguna iniciativa si esta persona intersex pertenece a otra organización mixta, pero no hay financiamiento específico para las organizaciones intersex.
So there is no specific financial support for intersex organizations. Only when a member is also participating in another organization, they can think about having funding.
Y en cuanto al el tercer tema que yo mencionaría como obstáculo, que es el tema de la seguridad, cada vez más se dan escaladas de violencia en contra de las organizaciones trans e intersex en los países latinoamericanos. De hecho, el mayor foco de agresión dentro de los países latinoamericanos son las personas trans, y cada vez más mueren personas trans en nuestros países latinoamericanos. Solo para poner un ejemplo, en los últimos 2 años han muerto 300 personas trans en Centroamérica.
Okay. And referring to the last point about the security of LGTBI community, she said that the violence is increasing more and more, and it's trans people and intersex, but trans people are most vulnerable for these attacks. For example, she made reference that in Latin America, every year they're dying 30 people.
300 personas
30
en los últimos 2 años.
In the last 2 years, sorry. 300. I'm
300.
sorry. Mm-hmm.
I think the work of human rights defenders in the Caribbean is particular. I think some of our issues across the globe is the same. However, when we look at the challenges we face, the Caribbean being 90% religious and still having sodomy and burglary laws on the books, and in some of the countries where cross-dressing as well as gross indecency laws exist, it's particularly problematic. The levels of stigma and discrimination in countries is high, and I think that it contributes to the level of violence that's perpetuated. Simply because with the sodomy law, persons believe that if they inflict violence against an LGBTI person, they're actually preventing someone from doing something illegal, and therefore they have the right. And with our laws of non-discrimination and hate crimes which are not enforced, it's particularly problematic. In many countries, human rights defenders really do not come out strongly on SOGI issues, and more often than not, when speaking about LGBTI persons, you more hear MSMs in the framework of HIV. The Caribbean also face particular issues around funding, because I think a number of funders fund the Caribbean when it was first rated as number 2 in the world as having been infested with HIV. And that's the only funding that really came to the Caribbean, and therefore MSMs were the only focus point because they were the most at-risk population. So consider activism around LGBT, lesbian, trans, intersex, bisexuals, still pretty much underfunded. Even now that we are working on the human rights platform and trying to get away from HIV being the focus, it's still problematic because generally a number of countries which really fund human rights activism do not fund the Caribbean. It is not a priority for them. And therefore, you find that it is really limiting, and those who do fund the Caribbean basically give you project funding where human rights defenders themselves, more often than not, are not paid, underpaid, or simply volunteers. When we look at how this also works in terms of society, many of those organizations are either not registered, or if they are registered, are under the radar, and therefore cannot apply for government funding. So I think a lot of these things kind of contribute to where the advocacy is in the Caribbean. And I think when people think about Caribbean, unfortunately, more often than not, they jump to islands like Jamaica and Dominican Republic and forget that it's a much larger community than just those two countries. What is unique to the Caribbean? I think there is nothing unique, but there are a lot of things unique simply because of where we're located, the populace that exists there, and simply the social and cultural aspects that affect us, which may not necessarily affect the rest of the globe.
Okay, so what are the main challenges for LGBTI human rights defenders? Well, I think as Joshua said initially, is that people who work on LGBTI or SOGI are first of all seen in many cultures as contravening social norms. So social norms on sexuality, sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, or social norms of the body. So just by speaking out or acting as an LGBTI defender, you're putting yourself at the forefront as someone who is contravening social norms. To me, I think that there needs to be UN level problem solving, but also regional level. Why I say that is because often, well, when you look at the SOGI report, for example, it picks up on different countries, but then the world is not flat, and in every region there are different ways that different countries can be influenced, which are specific to that region, that can't necessarily be addressed at the international level. So I think those two things have to work hand in hand. And I also think that LGBTI human rights defenders are often seen as soft targets, like what Kenita was saying, within a community. And I just want to talk about what is specific for trans human rights defenders. So trans people, both trans masculine and feminine people, often have interrupted education and therefore interrupted employment, and also have multiple levels of barriers to healthcare. And what happens is that when you have barriers to healthcare, barriers to steady employment and education, you have unhealthier people. Unhealthier people are less likely to be able to do work of any kind. That coupled with a general lack of funding on gender identity and gender expression globally means that you've got people who work on a volunteer basis, and I'm talking not just in developing countries, but I'm also talking about global north or first world countries, where very often trans and intersex organizations and activists are underfunded. And this cuts across the entire globe. So as Natasha mentioned, the study done by GATE, the Global Action for Trans Equality, surveyed groups, trans and intersex groups around the world, and it found that, yes, that a lot of organizations and activists work for free, and the ones that have funding, I think the majority of them worked on a budget of $0 to $5,000 or $10,000 a year. So this is a big problem, and how do we address the gap in funding, and how do we have healthier activists doing the work?
Thank you, Zhan. So I think that that in terms of sort of setting the context in which human rights defenders that work on SOGI issues are working within, Zhan already mentioned the High Commissioner's report, which was presented this session. It's the High Commissioner's report on violence and discrimination against individuals based on their sexual orientation and gender identity, which was presented yesterday, and there was also a general debate that followed. Given the context at the national level, I was wondering if the panelists could comment on their thoughts on this report. What aspects of this report is useful for your national level work, for your national level advocacy? And are there any gaps to the report that you would want to see filled with future initiatives? Maybe we do reverse order and Zhan can start first.
Okay, so yes, the report is great. Of course, I'm overjoyed it exists. Of course, I'm overjoyed that the Human Rights Council is looking at SOGI issues. Of course, I'm overjoyed that the Office of the High Commissioner has come up with this report. And if every region in the world and every country could implement all the recommendations listed, then I think a lot of our problems would be solved. So. Yeah, in terms of the national level, maybe I'll talk about my country, which is Singapore. It would be, for us, very important that we can have freedom of association and freedom of assembly. So in Singapore, and this is an interesting thing, because when you look at ASEAN or Southeast Asia or Asia, Singapore is often seen as, let's not worry about Singapore because it's such a well-off country. But there is only one place in Singapore that you are allowed to gather without getting police clearance for a license. And that place is a square called Hong Lim Park. So what the LGBT community has done is that they've done this event there for the last 6 years. But outside of that, you can't gather. You have to get police permission. So that's a big thing for us. Gaps. One of the recommendations was to ensure that LGBT and intersex persons and organizations are consulted with regard to legislation and policies that have an impact on their rights. I would add consulted and paid, because I work at ILGA now, and this is the first time that I've received a cent for any LGBTI work, and I'm 40 years old. So, it's a long time coming that we love to be consulted, but we would also really like to be part of the team, be part of the national human rights institutions, and to be paid properly, for a fair wage for a fair day's work, rather than feeding information to bodies and governments, and someone else is paid.
I think Zhan has actually taken the point that I really wanted to elaborate on, because I think this was one of the biggest recommendations for us that I actually see being implemented in country. And so, although our Prime Minister's office doesn't directly call us, but we do now have different ministries like the Ministry of Health or Tourism that would actually bring in United and Strong for consultation on different matters. Not being paid, but our ideas certainly sometimes taken into consideration. I think we welcome this report, seeing that it's the first report actually written since 2011. It's the first report of its kind since we requested it. I think one of the gaps for me was the invisibility of lesbians within that report and it not really calling to the issues that that's being faced. And I hope that the next report that follows would kind of zoom in a bit to deal with lesbian issues. I felt this report really took into gender identity and intersex issues, which is great, but at the same time, invisibilizing lesbians, except to, I think there was a particular, if I recall, Andre Draw referenced this to me in terms of the family. But then again, do we always want to be grouped under a family setting? And I think this is one of the stereotypes that still kind of happen in that report. In terms of the other recommendations, I think something that we'd like to see states actually take on board is the sensitizing and educating of the general public and bringing this issue where they are able to speak to it more, especially in the global south. And, you know, collaborating with civil society to ensure that happens on the ground, and which means they're actually acknowledging and building partnerships, something that we hope to see happen. And maybe at some point governments too can actually support LGBT organizations, you know, provide that honorarium that these human rights defenders can continue the work and not live in fear. So increased security would also be the other point.
En cuanto al reporte y los posibles vacíos que podrían haber, yo insistiría en el asunto de la seguridad para quienes somos defensores o defensoras, cómo incrementar la seguridad o implementar medidas de seguridad para quienes somos defensores y defensoras en nuestros países, sobre todo en Latinoamérica. Sí tendríamos muchos obstáculos, o sea, yo sí encuentro las recomendaciones que da el Alto Comisionado muy válidas y que reúnen la mayoría de los puntos de nuestras poblaciones, pero sí, sí tengo que admitir que tendríamos muchos obstáculos, sobre todo en Costa Rica, para basarlo específicamente en mi país, porque tenemos una asamblea legislativa que está manejada básicamente por diputados que son fundamentalistas religiosos, y entonces eso impide de que muchas de las recomendaciones sean implementadas.
So referring to the caps, she says that one important thing would be to guarantee the security for the defenders of this community in their countries, and more specifically in Latin America. So in general, she thinks that recommendations from this report are good, but that she has to admit that, for example, in Costa Rica, they still face some obstacles. For example, the Legislative Assembly, there are loads of the religious fundamentalism has a lot of power, and sometimes they cannot fight against this.
Celebro de que en las recomendaciones se haya mencionado el tema trans y el tema intersex, pero sí siento que hay que reforzar un poco más el tema intersex dentro de las recomendaciones, y también coincido con Kenita que el tema hay una invisibilidad del tema lésbico dentro de las recomendaciones.
So she is glad that in this report the subjects of transsexuality and intersexuality were mentioned, but she would like to reinforce the intersex. And as Kenita says, she agrees with Kenita in the invisibility of lesbian women.
You know, like I think everyone else, we definitely welcome the report. It's great to see something from the Human Rights Council that focuses specifically on SOGI issues. In terms of usefulness at a national level, I think that the report is quite comprehensive, and it does a good job of reminding states of their international obligations. And it also, you know, in terms of violence, torture, and ill treatment, and it also makes very specific recommendations to states. And like Zhan said, if states would take on those recommendations, it would do a lot in helping a lot of the challenges that we face. I think it would be encouraging to maybe start seeing implementation plans around the recommendations being developed from different regions. I think that would be very useful. And I think also the call to national human rights institutions to pay more attention to this issue is also very useful, and that we need to actively engage in making sure that national human rights institutions, which exist in many countries, do start paying more systematic attention to the issues. Yeah, I think the gaps were fairly well covered by everyone else. And I think it's also really great that it touches on specific cases in different states, because of the fact that there is lack of systematic attention to the issue. You often don't get to hear about the violations against LGBTI people, and it does a good job in touching on some of that. And also I like that it speaks a bit about the positive development, and perhaps we can find ways to see how certain countries which have been mentioned in terms of positive development, like, you know, the national task team that's been developed in South Africa, how can that be maybe replicated or learned from in other contexts and benchmarked from. Yeah.
Thanks, Joshua. You mentioned just now the lack of systematic attention and how this report is useful in at least spotlighting at this particular instance the situation of LGBTI people around the world. I was wondering whether the panel can expand on this a little bit, but more in terms of having a discussion of from your perspective, what needs to come next, how not only individual states need to implement the recommendations, but also the international community, the Human Rights Council, needs to take this issue forwards. So in the perspective of this panel, what would be the ideal response of the Human Rights Council in moving forwards on this issue? Again, maybe this way now.
I think, yeah, definitely one of the main problems is the fact that there is a lack of systematic attention to the issue. And it would be disappointing if it all ended with just this report, you know. So we would hope that that the UN system does build on this. I think in terms of I think the implementation plans or like development of that is also fairly important. For example, one of the recommendations was around states addressing violence by prohibiting the instigation of hatred and violence, and holding to account those who are responsible for hate speech. And I think this is very important, especially in the African context, because we've seen a lot of hate speech that has resulted in an incredible amount of violence and in the loss of many lives. And I think one of the most encouraging things that I've seen is the trial of Scott Lively in the US, which is in relation to the tort statute, which actually allows citizens of other countries to bring cases to the American courts for violations against international law, including such as crimes against humanities, and he's being held to account for what he's done, in terms of the Kill the Gay resolution and Kill the Gay law in Uganda in 2009, and the Court of Appeals in 2012 voted to dismiss his request for dismissal, his petition for dismissal in 2013. So we hope that what we'd like to see, I think, is perhaps a way for a more concrete way for states as well as the system to deal with violations themselves. Yeah, I think.
Bueno, yo pensaría otra vez en tres temas, digamos, principales para este punto. Uno podría hacer, digamos, como tres buenas prácticas que se podrían implementar dentro de las Naciones Unidas o del espacio de las Naciones Unidas.
She would like to talk about 3 different practices that could be carried in the UN.
Uno podría ser el generar mayor participación de la sociedad civil dentro de los espacios de las Naciones Unidas, ya sea a través de exámenes periódicos universales, a través de reportes, o sea, que se haya una mayor participación de la sociedad civil en los diferentes espacios de las Naciones Unidas, donde se pueda hablar y denunciar las situaciones que se viven en nuestros países.
So firstly, she would like that there was more participation of the civil society, within the UN. So for example, by writing reports, by writing universal periodic reviews, and by talking more concretely about these subjects.
Estos espacios ayudan mucho para que la sociedad civil tenga una voz dentro de las Naciones Unidas y que los estados también sepan cuáles son nuestras situaciones.
So these spaces would help a lot to the civil society to be able to give their opinion and to create a relationship.
Otro punto sería generar espacios de diálogo entre la sociedad civil y los estados, donde se puedan hablar abiertamente sobre los temas que nos aquejan.
Another thing that could be done is to generate some spaces of dialogue where the civil society and states could openly talk about these subjects.
Y también podría hablar de que se generen también consultas más más profundas de parte de los altos comisionados con la sociedad civil, o sea, que sean más extensas estas consultas, que sean más participativas, donde más voces puedan participar de estas consultas y que todas las situaciones que se viven en los diferentes países queden plasmados en los informes y que no haya precisamente vacíos dentro de los informes.
Okay, and the third thing would be to make a better consultation. So that means that the High Commissioner would have a more between the civil society and the High Commissioner to have a better consultation. That is, for example, to treat this subject more extensively, to open up this talk, making more participation, and that way to see what really happens to talk directly with the member states.
Y como un cuarto punto, yo también podría decir de que se genere de parte de las Naciones Unidas o de los altos comisionados un manual de buenas prácticas que se comparta con los diferentes estados y que reúna precisamente todas las buenas iniciativas que ya han implementado otros países y que sirva como un documento que se pueda compartir con los diferentes estados.
And finally, to generate between the High Commissioner and, to generate good practices and
Un manual de buenas prácticas.
The good practices to work with member states and to be able to document everything more profoundly.
I think one of the things probably I'd like to see happen is where the UN can develop more of a framework that that allows for more implementation by states. A case where the outcome of documents at the UN is not just guiding principles for states, but something that probably they need to take under more of an implementation. And hopefully that they can actually have some kind of penalties for not implementing, really and truly. I think the accountability for human rights defenders being killed or being violated in countries is not something that should be taken lightly. And when I speak about human rights defenders here, I'm going more broadly, not just SOGI or sexual rights, we're talking across the board. And I think when I look at the intersection at which a lot of us work with other defenders, whether it's on disability, whether it's on land rights, we all come back with the same issue that, yes, we take a lot of time and we document and we write those reports, but in the mechanisms that we use right now really it brings visibility to the issue, but it doesn't really give a lot in terms of implementing nationally, and I think that's where the gaps are in terms of being able to use the international mechanisms and what we are able to establish at the national level. At the national level, organizations being able to work in collaboration to apply that pressure is one. Noting that security is always a major issue for any defender. And even when we look at collaborating across different issues, persons working on land rights or environment or climate change, more often than not, are actually afraid of working on sexual rights and SOGI issues simply because it carries a higher penalty of discrimination than what they might be working on. So I think there needs to have this kind of mechanism that holds states accountable about implementing whatever that they may agree to at the international level or sign on to at the international level. I also think that for us personally, I look at the Organization of American States and what they have been able to establish, and even being able to get a rapporteur on on SOGI is a major advancement. And when we look at SOGI, speaking to that rapporteur, we know it's not just for lesbian, gay, bisexual, but it's also a broader heading of bodily diversity and sexual diversity. And I think that kind of speaks to where we should be heading and not just keep in the binary at the UN.
Okay, so I think the most important thing is that if you look at the recommendations of the report, it's nothing special what we're asking for, right? So what the LGBTI community is asking for is to see LGBTI human rights as mainstream human rights, rather than as particular human rights to be given to a special class of people in society. And I think that that would help states which are resistant to turning their minds to LGBTI human rights, because they might see it as being against some sort of cultural identity or religious identity or national identity or regional identity. And I think this is where the work needs to be done to translate the language of the report and to translate the implementations into having states understand that it's a cross-cutting issue, right? You use that term a lot, but you know that there are LGBTI people in every country, in every religion, and in every culture, in every society. So that's the first step. And then also to mainstream LGBTI work, so that when governments are looking at policies that have to do with reproduction, that they think about LGBTI identities within that. If you're looking at education, you think about, well, how are LGBTI people prevented from accessing full education in your country? When you look at women and girls, you don't leave out trans and intersex women in that dialogue. When you look at reproductive health, you also think about how the different groups, L, the G, the B, the T, and the I have different specific needs. So this is it seems so simple, but it really is about bringing it to a level up of mainstream and also bringing it up to a level of commonality across regions, across cultures, across religions. And then this is also the work of civil society groups to keep reminding them that it's not about a special class of people.